Welcome to the Great Security Debate. This show has experts taking sides to help broaden understanding of a topic. Therefore, it's safe to say that the views expressed are not necessarily those of the people we work with or for. Heck, they may not even represent our own views, as we take a position for the sake of the debate. Our website is greatsecurity.debate.net, and you can contact us via email at feedback@greatsecurity.debate.net or on Twitter @securitydebate. Now, let's join the debate already in progress.
As you think about it, I think so much of when we're building programs, it's all about stop, right? Can you stop this? Can you stop this? But we look at things at how quickly can we pivot? How quickly can we look back and realize what actually happened? And we got to be honest, this is not going to slow down anytime soon. I mean, if you go on the heels of SolarWinds and we see this is just going to continue to ramp up. And it's all about agility, look back, and time to understand if we're vulnerable or not, or what the actual exposure is.
Yeah, no, I totally agree there. Because it too often does the conversation come where it's, okay, here's the 45 things that we threw at your product. You stopped 43 of them. They stopped
Right.
41. These guys only stopped 37, right? And it's, yeah. So
number 49 is the one that kills you.
right.
We,
you're like, we won, right?
We got to give kudos though on this whole thing to Cyber Reason. On their fix and using the actual exploit to close the hole. I love that model.
See, and the naming of it too, because someone was like, that's not a vaccine. I'm like, well, actually, it really kind of is a vaccine because you're injecting yourself with the vulnerability, which is what we do with a vaccine. We give ourselves a little bit of it, hoping to build the antibodies, right? And that's essentially what they did with the code was, we'll find it, we'll use the vaccine, inject it into us, and then add a line of code to it, right? Where then it will go ahead and shut it down.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's definitely some different philosophies that came out around that, because I know there was a whole, I don't want to say subculture, but there was a whole group of people who are like, no, I am not pulling the trigger on an exploit. It almost goes back to like lock picking rules, right? You never pick your own door locks in case you break something or something along those lines. And I could see some of that, but it was quick and effective.
Before we dive into it, Eric, you want to describe a little bit about what Log4j is and was and still is?
Yeah, so Log4j, it's a Java-based application used for logging. Typically, you see this in Apache servers. You're also in a lot of other open source projects. And I forget the statistic. Could pull it up and maybe put it in the show notes that the Google actually went back and looked at the number of projects that were in it was one big repo with a lot of Java-based open source applications. And
yeah, that was actually started by a friend, Dan Cuthbert, and another friend of his out in the UK that then CISA has actually taken over the list ever since.
Oh, nice.
It was just a wonderful effort and helped immensely to the industry. But yeah, and I think 80 or 90% of all Java applications had the expectations. 80 or 90% of all Java applications had Log4j involved in it.
Yeah, the crazy thing about it is the ease of exploit on this one. It was interesting as we were watching. We saw some creative. I mean, running Fortinets, it doesn't matter what firewall you're looking at, that we all had our signatures that were able to look at some of those attacks. And there were some creative ones that came through. But if you look at it, so one of the responses we did right away is came up with a curl script that you could actually pivot through and look at and see if you could get a response back to a netcat listener or something along those lines. And now I'm heading down the technical rabbit hole. But the ease of being able to script something out and run it was very, very low on this one. And that's why, what was it? Within 24 hours, there was over 800,000 attacks or something along those lines. I mean, it was really quick. I mean, that's also the proliferation of cloud services and just kind of the commoditization and monetization of security and everything that goes on right now. But this was massive.
Yeah, it was pretty huge and fast and iterating. Well, I guess the issue wasn't iterating. The resolution was iterating. one of the interesting parts was there was a patch out relatively quickly. So I guess the first thing is this issue has been around for a very long time. This is not new. I think it's been raised out in the public prior to the last few weeks. So this isn't something that was just newly discovered. It was actually newly publicized.
Yeah.
And I think that's what really gave got it the rocket fuel to be visible and people to start writing more visible attacks against it. So I mean that's another interesting part is that I said this has been around for a while. So the fact that so many people still had it well, I guess that Apache hadn't done anything with it is also an interesting and unfortunate result.
Right. Well, I think we know for next time that nothing gets done until it affects Minecraft servers, and then all of a sudden everything changes.
Well, the fact that my son came to me, I mean, my son is of an age where this is a topic that comes up regularly, the idea of security and patching and installing updates and the pain that it is to install updates. And he sent me a thing from Minecraft, well, from the front screen saying there's a serious Java vulnerability you need to update right now. And it actually sparked a really interesting and great set of discussions with him about what it is, what the issue was, why it's hitting Minecraft. So maybe this issue actually just sparked a whole bunch of Minecrafters, especially younger ones, that might want to go into the information security field. So that's my hope. If so, study hard and apply for all the lots of jobs that are open.
I mean, hey, if you take it on that thread, it's always been interesting. If you look at historically in gaming, specifically PC gaming, there's always been a level of kind of security and hacking that's been involved with it. I remember back in the day playing Counter-Strike quite a bit, and the number of either bots or mods and stuff that were written to give you that little bit of competitive edge. If you can mobilize the gamer community, it's powerful.
Oh yeah. And especially if it gives them a chance to work against the anti-cheat technologies that are out there, which everybody loves to hate. If you're in gaming, I say go for it. Come into the field. We want you and we need you.
What exactly, so for Log4j, from a logging perspective, why is logging important? Because some of this goes back to when you look at programmers when they're developing applications as a way, when we look at keeping track of things, how we try to inherently build in quality to be able to have quality checks to go back to, right? And I was going to pivot and use this from an automotive perspective, because when you look at a lot of times the quality inspection reports, the QIRs that are used for every part that's built, if you go back the last 50 years and looked at the first one that was made for, say, like a door frame or for some motor assembly, and you go back to the one today, almost 90% of it is cut and paste from the one from 50 years ago, because it just keeps getting reused, and they only change a little bit based on the new. But what's to say that 50 years ago they overlooked something, right?
Sure.
And it's going to rear, and you don't know that until it rears its ugly head, and then you're going back to redo your quality inspection report. And I look at Log4j in a similar matter, right? Because keeping track of what happens, in your software applications and your online services, but lo and behold, there was a vulnerability, and now that we know about it, we're trying to go all the way back to see if we can fix it.
Yeah, and those things, they get introduced and they stay. But the once it was publicized, there was a lot of people scrambling, trying to figure out how to approach this, because the exploit was, like you mentioned earlier, the exploit was so easy. You literally sent a string of code, and as long as that log parser was somewhere in the chain, it was going to drop down and give full system control to the attacker that did it. So it was trivially easy. Anybody could do it. You didn't even have to have like an entry to put a pass in the URL, and if it ended up in the logs. But so people were scrambling while a patch was being developed. Cyber Reason came out with a aptly named vaccine, which was I think appreciated by the whole industry. It wasn't a product, it wasn't a push to buy something. It was, here it is, and it's for the greater good, much like vaccines are. So that was a really neat evolution and contribution. But at the same time, and we were also watching as the patches were being developed and tested, and the thing that came to mind, and I'm curious about the way that both of you see this, is that there was concern over the first patch, over its stability, and there were these camps that were starting to show up inside organizations of, do I wait to patch and affect the stability of my application? Or maybe there'll be another patch and do I have to do it again? Or do I patch as they come and close down this vulnerability, but perhaps introduce other things because of the quickness with which these patches were being updated and released? And it really, it created a lot of internal discussion. And I saw people go into those two camps of, I'm going to wait until this levels out and I'm going to patch each one as it goes. Erik, do you want to talk a little bit? Can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons of both of those approaches? Or maybe Brian, you take the pro and Erik, you take the con, and we can do some debate.
All right, rock, paper, scissors. Which one you want?
I'll go pro, you go con.
So you're going pro patch right away.
Pro patch as it comes. Yeah.
All right, floor's yours.
Perfect. So I think this goes to visibility as well. It's something, again, everyone's going to throw egg at me as I say this, but when you go back to automotive, so you instantly find something that could be a warranty problem, right? You haven't established that, but there's been a failure and there's been more than one, and they're starting to rise. Quickly, you've been contacted by your customer, right? In this case, somebody in the wild found it in the Alibaba cloud group, right? And turn that information over. And Dan, one thing we'll come back to on that is now what's happened to Alibaba because of how they reported it and what the Chinese government is now doing to them.
Yeah.
Which is a whole nother, ball of wax. But so you immediately know you have an issue. So right away, at least in auto, the customer is going to say, okay, and the customer being the OE, the Fords, the GMs, the Volkswagens, right? What are we going to do? So you have a short-term countermeasure and a long-term countermeasure. And you might actually have more than one short-term countermeasure that you put together to say, this is what we have to do right now to stop the bleeding and to make sure everything coming off your line is not affected. Here's the long-term countermeasure, though, for everything that could be in the field, right? And that's just using one example, because there could be different short-term and different long-term countermeasures, because long-term, you also might have to come back and redo tooling. You may have to redo your assembly. You may have to add quality controls into your process. You have to relook at, what your quality controls were, right? What your PFEMA was, and say, this was a clear failure that we didn't see. Now we need to go look at everything else we've done that applies the same logic, right? Because we're only talking about one subassembly. In this case, I would love to say that the first patch put out there was the short-term countermeasure, but they don't explain that. And the people in the field are like, this is the patch. And I think this is where transparency becomes really important, to say, okay, guys, we put a patch out there right away. We believe this to be a short-term countermeasure as we continue to investigate the other paths into this vulnerability and how it can be exploited, et cetera. Had they done that, some people would have said, I'm willing to do the short-term countermeasure real quick. And Dan, this goes back to the vaccine as well, Erik. When you looked at it, the concept of it was great, but it was kind of, I won't call it a short-term countermeasure. It wasn't going to handle all the problems that were out there. But for a lot of companies, this was a great fix. You're able to, in the short, it uses itself to set the flag that turns it off, which is great, right? It's the same thing with a vaccine. Give yourself a shot. But what people were concerned with is how embedded Log4J was, how deep it got. And that's where you got to have, well, we're also going to have a long-term countermeasure, because this could take us weeks, months to really dig all the way down and do a 5 why which this could turn into a 5,000 why before we figure out all the different root causes that could come from it.
Yeah, and it's important to remember there was actually, as you talk about short-term countermeasures beforehand, there was actually a set of configuration variables that could have been changed in your Log4j instances. Now, this of course only works on the ones you know about and control,
Right.
and can prevent at the network level, these strings from ever coming through. But there was that as the short term as well, that was available to people. So you had, the other thing was there was just different levels of options, and I think that also caused a bit of confusion.
Yeah. Continuing on the medical theme, sometimes the side effects are worse than what you're actually trying to remedy. And that's how, and a lot of times, I think a lot of people look at patches. To pick on Microsoft, historically, that's been one of the problems. That do you really want to be in that first band? No, because some of the outages that you end up causing being in that first band are far worse than what you're trying to protect against. But I think the argument to wait on the patch is, number one, as soon as these things hit the news now, that it becomes frantic, because you have a lot of what I'll call semi-technologists that read these headlines and go, we have to patch, we have to do this, the world's on fire, let's take a step back. This isn't the only control. We've been talking about depth and layers of security for the longest time. That if you do it from the outside in, you've got firewalls, you've got EDR, you've got all of these different layers that you can put controls in that mitigate it. And to liken this back to, if you remember when Spectre and Meltdown came out, anyway, that was when Intel, you could actually grab a hold and run. I'm trying to think how to explain this one. This one's a more technical one.
Microcode is not a one sentence description.
Yeah. But it was a vulnerability on the processor itself, that in a multi-tenant environment, you could run code and see things in other environments. So if you look at that, a lot of companies go, oh, we got to patch right away. Well, let's look at the risk holistically, right? That if you're not in a multi-tenanted environment, if you're not exposing some of those elements to the internet, what is your actual risk posture? If somebody was able to grab in the Spectre and Meltdown situation, if somebody was able to grab a hold and have administrative access onto your server, you're done already. It doesn't matter if that vulnerability is there. The same thing on Log4j, right? What's the most critical? Internet facing. Okay, once you rule out internet facing and you don't have anything, okay, yes, we have another vulnerability that's within our environment. But again, to take advantage of that vulnerability, somebody already has to be in your environment. And is that the only thing you're worried about? I mean, let's go back. Let's look at any company that's running Active Directory. The vast majority get it wrong, and it's a sieve for security permissions. And there's much bigger things to worry about. I'm not saying don't worry about it, but I think in that case, there was a lot of trepidation that the patch could break production systems when we had other controls that we could put in place.
And there's been, just to take what you said and extend it out, there's been an interesting set of discussions out in the world since this as well, about people who take the approach of, if this happens, we've got bigger things to worry about. That right. Answer. And that's an extension of what you said, but I think it's more hyperbole than what you said. I think has merit, but taking that extension, I think also is worrisome. I would agree. And this is where the CIO and the CISO discussion becomes quite interesting, because it's about service resumption. Let's get my people back up and going. What do we have that we can do? Or it's, hey, we've got other things going on. It's end of year. We're doing end of year processing. We just literally, most companies had literally entered a change freeze that afternoon. There's just a universal change freeze. It seems to show up that Friday before, 2 Fridays before the last 2 weeks, so that all of end of year computer processing happens. So I know I've heard people making the claim, not just on this issue, but on others, but if we get to this point, we've got way bigger things to worry about. But I think that is taking your argument just a bit too far, because then it's, let's just burn the whole thing down.
Right. You have to be, it is a slippery slope argument, because if you look at it, I've heard it play out with those that have moved to Azure, to AWS, and some of those that it's secure by virtue of the customers that are already there. that if something happens, there's bigger headlines than us, therefore you don't have to be worried about, right? It's almost harkening back to the whole idea of security through obscurity. And I think the three of us would agree that that's not a good approach.
And that works fine when you're talking about what order the EU is going to come after you in terms of GDPR, because
Right.
there are bigger fish. In the technology space, in the attack space, the level and speed of the scanning technology, of the automated exploit technology doesn't give a damn.
Right.
If you are small, big, or otherwise. If you have an IP out there, it's going to come after and take it.
But
I think go ahead,
Brian. Go ahead.
I was going to throw out there. So Eric, one thing you mentioned, and this was around the Active Directory part, right? That a lot of these vulnerabilities, you would actually have to have someone in the environment first to be able to use the vulnerability. So, how Active Directory was set up, are people exploiting Active Directory misconfigurations, et cetera. And I would totally agree with you there, Eric, that there's enough organizations and you don't have to go after the biggest ones, right? In order to find, mistakes that have been made, right? Or assumptions that were made years ago that are still living within that Active Directory.
We've always done it this way. Therefore, we shall continue to do it this way.
And if you go after the smaller ones, there's an infinitesimally small chance that you'll be seen or caught and you can go live there forever.
Right.
So going back to the pro side of this is, if you really jump in and do the 5 why, it's not just, can we locate all of our assets? Then ask, no, why? Right? And when you answer that part of the why, well, we don't have any way to do that because we don't have it, right? Or this is how it's always been done, so we've never kept track of it. Then you start to ask yourself, where else do we do that? Right? Well, how is this exploited then? Are we vulnerable? Well, only if somebody's living in our environment. Is someone living in our environment? We don't know. Why? Well, because of, so as you ask those whys, you start to uncover bigger problems. Yeah. And it's not to come back and say, well, clearly security is not doing the right job. It's looking at it and saying, just like you said, Dan, from the CIO CISO perspective of, well, why do we invest so much over here to keep all these business applications and services going and generating revenue, but over here, we're not so concerned with it. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. But even when OEs were coming back to said suppliers to ask them, well, we need to go see all of our assets, all right? And they're talking about tools, right? Injection molding tools, stamping tools, et cetera, that we purchased over the last 20 years. And we're like, really? Let's go try to find them, right? And they're like, well, what do you mean? You don't keep an asset inventory of every asset tag and every asset number we sent you? You could pick one program, right? And we might have 300 assets just for that program, but yet we've launched over 80 with them in the last 5, 6, 7 years across all the different OEs. Some of those tools are stored in warehouse sheds, et cetera. When those OEs came looking for them and saw like where they were being kept and how some of the warehouses, even some of the what do you call it? The racking had fallen. So tools were on top of tools. Those tools weren't going to work the same again, right? Like, and that's how you were inventorying it. It's like, well, this is how we've always done it.
So, and that is a perfect transition, because I was going to mention this. This yet again put a spotlight on all of our security programs around inventory. Anybody who knows me knows I love the CIS. It used to be the top 20. It's now the top 18. But it's a linear set of controls that you have to have. They build upon each other. And what are the first two? Inventory and control enterprise assets. Number 2 is software, right? And we yet again proved that none of us have a great handle on that.
And what's the first question an auditor asks when they walk in the door? Please provide me with your inventory of systems, of suppliers, et cetera. But it's even more interesting and at the risk of regressing to an episode in the past around third-party risk, now with the inclusion of SaaS and so much dependency on third parties, which has amped up our game operationally so significantly, we now have to make sure that we can account for all of them, because part of the discussions when Log4j came through was, okay, fine, we know we don't run Java, we know we don't run Log4j, or we do, but with embedded within these apps that we run or third-party systems, I don't know about you guys, but I both sent and received a flood of messages that day of, please tell me how, do you contain Log4j? Do you, have you mitigated it? When will you mitigate it? Those are the ones I received. Mine were far less mechanical. But it just then becomes this cascade of, do you? Yes, I do. Do you? No, I don't. And trying to understand all your third parties.
Those surveys though, I mean, to me, it seems like it's very perfunctory process. Because what are you going to do? What are you going to do that a company, a SaaS provider comes back? Yeah, we do use Log4j. We're going to patch it at this time. So, now what? What if they came back and said, we're not going to patch it? We're just going to put other mitigating controls. Are you going to move away just because of that? No, it is a very check the box activity that we're not doing anything with. And I don't think it provides a lot of value. Sure, maybe it provides a little bit of extra transparency, but it's a lot of extra work when we could have been focusing internally.
Yeah, but posting something, the thing is, we didn't see a lot of people, at least not those outside of the security industry. I guess maybe it was lack of awareness, but but we didn't. One of the approaches that would have been nice was almost like a disclosures page or something on your security
companies
page
getting out ahead of it.
Companies getting out ahead of it and publishing and saying, we do, or sending a message to all customers saying, yes, we do, yes, we don't.
We can fix this. Put it on Facebook. Every time there's an event that says I'm safe from such and such event, just create a Log4j event and we can all sign on and say we're safe from it.
Hey, one
Except
thing
me, I don't, because I won't use it.
And Dan,
I won't either.
This goes back on the contract side. The spend isn't like $100 million like it is with like an OE supplier. So when they send out these surveys, because one supplier had an incident, right? So they send it out to all the suppliers. You have to fill it out in 24 hours and they'll come back within the next 24 hours. If you put there that, this is going to take us 1 week, but this is talking about manufacturing on this side. And Eric, I get what you're saying. Well, really, what are you guys going to do? In automotive, they'll be like, yeah, we will pull your business, but here, are you really going to pull the business?
But not tomorrow. Not in a meaningful, impactful way. They're not going to say, stop all work for us tomorrow and we're going to halt the production lines.
Yeah, but what I'm throwing this back to though, because that's built into the contracts on the auto side, right? So you look back here on those terms of service, et cetera. This goes back to some of the questions that are asked around your own cybersecurity posture and how you handle patching, et cetera. You come out with one of those surveys and ask the question and they reply back with something that is how do I say this, is not reflective of the answer they gave you when they originally signed on to be your vendor, right? And I should be careful even talking about this because I'm on the vendor side, but I would think if you looked at it from a contractual standpoint, those are some of the things that you put in there that you would never think that you'd ever have to come back to. But sometimes given these cases, Eric, like you said, well, what's the point of them? Well, maybe when the renewal comes up, you say, hey, based on how you guys handled this, you broke your contract with us. You're in breach, right?
But there is this all assumes that there's this overtone that running Log4j was a bad thing. Until 2 weeks ago, running Log4j was just a product, a piece of software in a product that everybody ran.
It was the fiscally responsible thing to do.
Exactly.
It was free.
It was free, which then let's in a minute cover the cost of free. But and community supported applications. There's risks and benefits to it worth thinking about that are the cost of free. So I'll expand on that. What is the cost of free? But honestly, so I was going through with clients and having this discussion about, how do we respond? How do we post out and say what we do? And there was this feeling that people had done something wrong by running Log4j.
Yeah.
But they hadn't. This was just like saying I run Microsoft Word.
But Dan, that's an extension of how we look at data breaches as well. Look, and I know we've talked about this before, if you historically go back and look at somebody who robbed a bank, you're not going to point the finger at the bank unless there was some gross negligence or something there. We pointed at the bank robbers. They were at fault. But when it comes to security breaches, it's the company's fault. We don't focus on the perpetrators who did it or anything like that. It's amazing that we play the shame game with the organization.
Look at Pegasus. Look at the NSO. Like, they're like, guys, we built it. It's a weapon, right? We built the weapon just like you build guns and ammunition, and we provide it to clients. We tell them not to use it for bad, and then they did. But all the focus is on them. And Dan, I'm taking this one very, like, throwing it very far-fetched, not far-fetched at all, but from the defense of, we built this tool that can be used for certain good, but we definitely know it can be used for a lot of bad, depending on who gets it. And yes, half of our client list is known not to be great.
But Log4J there's a difference between building a bomb and saying don't use it for bad things, and and a logging application.
No, totally. And one of the things when I put out there, I said, this could come back to contracts, right? Mm-hmm. When you put in how you guys handle you could put in how you handle your patching, how you know, just like your SLAs for how you handle alerts and remediation and stuff like that. The same thing could be said there. Where I was going with it, and this goes back to a pro and con of, can you really put that in there? Because if you answer, you're trying to show yourself in a positive light. So you say, yeah, we can meet those requests, right? But then when things like Log4J happen, do you really want to patch quick, Erik, like you said? Or take the Brian approach of, well, maybe there's a short-term and a long-term countermeasure, because everybody's environments are different.
Right. Well, from the people who brought you, let's hard code in our contracts the requirement that passwords be 8 characters, 1 upper, 1 lower, and 1 special 10 years ago. And the contracts still reflect that, even though technology and good sense have moved on, but you can't move off it because the contract still says that, and no one wants to reopen the contract because of other commercial reasons.
Yeah, I mean, going further on the contract side, I think the effect of this is going to be far less than it probably should be. Because I think that, I mean, Brian, I'd be interested in your perspective on this, because I think it takes a procurement department that is fundamentally aware of the security side and the potential impact. You know, as I look at procurement departments, they're very good at understanding the business risk, financial risk, supply chain, all of those components. But I haven't heard of any company that's got it really dialed in on taking in the security aspect, the controls there, and melding that into the overall risk equation.
Well, they do. They exist. I'll let Brian go, but those definitely do exist, but they are bigger. They're places where there's resources, and there's oftentimes places that have been burned.
Well, and I will say, I think we're all trending in that direction. So it's not like we're doing nothing, but.
Now that I've been in the security and in the tech space outside of automotive, when you look at automotive, their purchasing and procurement groups are massive, right? Just because of all the finished goods they're buying. But when you look at their indirect groups that purchase the security products, the tech products, et cetera, they're much smaller. And while they understand their business, I don't think they're as in tune to the impacts that certain products are going to have on the overall business or what the business is trying to accomplish. But then on the flip side of that, I've worked with companies that purchase very little in finished good product, but they purchase a ton of software. So they have a big purchasing team that's really in tune with the entire tech team, not necessarily the business, but they really understand the different, not necessarily the products per se that they're buying, but the impacts those products have with the other tools that they're buying, and maybe why best of breed versus best of suite. They actually have a conversation around that. You don't find that a lot in purchasing. Normally purchasing is just getting the direction from their security team or their tech team, which is why a lot of times the security and tech teams can push the narrative of the product they want, right? Where purchasing is coming in and saying, well, we got to have a bake-off, and there is going to be a decision based on best of price as well, right? And the security team comes back and says, hopefully, well, let me show you best of price versus risk mitigation. Here's the level of risk I perceive here. Here's the level of risk I perceive here. And the same conversation should be had as eloquently as possible as, you know, given the number of people we have trying to run a SOC team or trying to run a group, here's the level of risk we have if we don't try to find additional people to be hired in, right? People versus just process versus product.
Right.
I probably got a little long-winded there, but I think there's not enough people on the purchasing side that would have that understanding across all the small, medium, large enterprises to really be effective.
No, I think it's coming together though. I think we're heading in the right direction, but I still see a lot of individuals, and I'll point at ourselves within the security community that still don't understand the difference between a feature patch, a security patch, and a vulnerability. A configurational vulnerability, I should say, that not kind of part of a patch. That there are definitions for each one of those, and those are different. So as you look at that from a contractual standpoint, I think a lot of people look at it, the control, we'll put in the control, thou shalt patch, right? Well, what does that actually mean? What are the SLAs around that? What is the criteria that meets those SLAs then? Because I mean, if it's a feature, who cares? Security is not involved with that, but you have to be able to delineate between the different avenues.
Does it mean moving toward a capability, more of a capabilities assessment versus an actual execution assessment? The questions are, do you have robust asset inventories? Do you understand your systems? How often are they updated? Do you have a risk? I mean, granted, these are, again, the questions, the answers. What is the motto in RFPs?
Who's defining each of those?
The answer is always yes. Let's figure out a way to get to yes.
Right.
But focusing on the capabilities versus the outcomes, can you make, I don't know how you write this into an RFP, but do you have the wherewithal and the mindset to take information and make a logical risk assessment on when patching is required, and will you do so?
I guess, I mean, this is kind of, now we're heading back into kind of why the SOC reports and all of that exist, right? That, what was it, the type 1, was it SOC 2 type 1?
That's the moment in time. Yeah.
Is there a process? Does it exist? And then as you get into type 2, all right, now let's assess the actual feasibility and is it being adhered to?
Right.
I see us heading somewhat into that space.
Yeah, no, it's but unfortunately, a lot of, even though at the best of intentions, things like SOC 2s have become checkboxes as well. Do you have a SOC 2? Yes. And then the recipient doesn't read it. Right. Doesn't understand where there are risks still baked within there. Because if you read a well done SOC 2 report, it's going to tell you if there are issues. It's going to tell you if there were deficiencies during the process. My encouragement is to read them.
It's not just the write up from the audit firm too. I mean, if you take a step back, looking at who the actual audit firm is, what are the sample sizes? Are the sample sizes actually appropriate to the controls and what's going on? I mean, there's a lot to it. But yeah, to your point, Dan, I think a lot of that, back to, it's gonna be my word of the day, perfunctory. I think a lot of that is just a checkbox activity that we did receive their updated SOC report. Well, nobody asked the question, did you actually read it? Are there any concerns in it? Because let's be honest, it's not the sexiest report to read through. I mean, if you're looking to fall asleep, it's good reading, but it's part of the job. You've got to do it.
One thing I was going to come back to on the Log4j side too, and this goes to understanding the different levels of exploits that could be out there. So you now find that you have this vulnerability, right? Do you patch right away? Do you not patch right away? What would be some of the, right? It depends. What would be some of the concerns? And one thing that I kept coming or kind of rising to the surface was ransomware. There was this worry about botnet ransomware. There was worry about just ransomware in general. And that one seemed to come right up to the surface. But Log4j, as embedded as it can be in applications, and if you didn't know it was there, could also be exploited if somebody was in there simply for stealing confidential information.
Yep.
Right.
And that's the one that,
or Bitcoin mining.
Or Bitcoin mining. But going back though, when someone says, well, are we vulnerable to this? Well, if we use Apache Log4j, yeah, we could be vulnerable. And well, what do we have to be worried about? And then, well, pick your flavor of the day and poison, depending if a threat actor is in here, because it's not just ransomware we should be worried about. There's several different types of exploits. And that's where I also think, from the standpoint of all the different security companies out there that immediately came out with different videos and so forth to say, oh, here we stop exploits on Log4j. You're just showing one version of an exploit that somebody's already put out there as a POC. And you show it and it's like, oh, those guys stop it. And immediately everybody starts liking it and sending it out, right? But that's just one type of exploit and the thousands of different exploits that are out there. And this goes back to people, process, product. Yeah, you'd love to have a product that stops 45 out of 45.
Right.
But the question isn't, does it stop everything? The question should be, when it doesn't stop everything, what do we do? And does your product help us when it doesn't?
Right. So pivoting back to Dan, is free really free?
I put an article to us, and I will put it in the show notes. It's called it's from the MIT Technology Review. The internet runs on free open source software. Who pays to fix it? Great piece. I would strongly recommend it, but it's the underpinning for the question of, I'm using free software where there are other costs. There's cost to run it. There's cost to maintain it. Yes. There's this prevailing thought that open source software is open, so people can look at it and find issues in it. Just because they can doesn't mean they have. So right. I am a huge supporter of the open source software movement, of free software, of things that are out there, tools that are made available. They're done with the best of intentions, but like anything, they get old, they get out of date, they get used and implemented, forgotten about, or the people who worked on them no longer have the time, who gave of their time to create them and maintain them, no longer have that ability to do so. And so they fall out of use. We see this with, let's just keep in the Log4j family. Let's look at Log4j version 1, which is not affected by this issue, by this particular vulnerability. It was a previous release. It's completely end of life. There are tons of companies still running on Log4j version 1. And interesting discussion sometimes has been, well, we're running version 1, so we're okay. We don't have to do anything. And then you come to the realization that version 1 is long end of life and has tons of other issues against it. And so that's not an answer either. But the price of free software is, you get what you pay for it. I'm not going to purposely not going to wheel out if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. I don't think that's the case in most of this world. It's one of the few exceptions. But there is, you get what you pay for might be a better, example. And there's lots of paid software that stinks. That has horrible support or has been bought by a company 7 acquisitions later, and it's where it goes to die. But we know that, and you make that decision because you're buying into a company, you're buying into their support model. But generally, if you're paying for a product, you will get support along with it, or the expectation of support. You have contractual obligations, back to all the things we just talked about. You can have contracts, right. You have paper in place. That's not a one unidirectional terms and conditions. And if something goes wrong, you oftentimes have to go to communities that may or may not be prepared to figure out what was going on. And you may just be stuck with, well, there's no patch and there's nothing we can do. So we're kind of stuck. And that's as an enterprise, especially if you're building it for critical software, something that runs your business or that is your business, you should always know how you're going to support that product before you put it in for the first time.
And that's I think the critical point about critical systems. That doing that analysis, what is the risk analysis? What are the SLAs? How important it is to the organization, and kind of running it through the gamut of, do we have the internal resources that we can support it and respond quickly? And if the answer is no, maybe that's not a good fit for something to go open source, right? Because your response time is mileage will vary, right?
And a lot of times these things are created inside companies, maybe not software companies, maybe, it's a tool I'm building and using for myself. And I put it out to open source because I want it to be shared. I want other people to be able to get the same benefit from it. But it doesn't mean that I'm going to be around forever to support it, or when something goes wrong in 4 years, that I'm going to come out of mothballs, or I'm going to stop doing my actual job that pays me in order to go maintain this thing that I put out to the world long ago. There's some expectation that that's the case, but it isn't always feasible. And Brian, you just shared a piece from the Technology Review product article around the I guess the extensiveness in which open source software runs the internet, including Apache.
Yeah, and I was going to throw this out there, Dan, to you and Eric, and try doing a pro and con, because in one comment, there's the underfunding of open source software is, quote, a systematic risk to the United States, to critical infrastructure, to banking, to finance, says the CTO at a security firm. Okay. And then on the flip side, though, the public is almost completely ignorant of the immense role and maybe also risk, right, of the free labor powered open source software that runs the internet. I thought one interesting example was I was reading the article in 2018, the developer behind the popular open source project called UA Parser JS quit. Like, he quit, just left, unwilling to work for free anymore. And then that software was used by Google, Amazon, Facebook. And the person that took it over was not such a good person, and then ended up putting in a bunch of malicious code into the project so that they could steal crypto, right? And at the end of the day, what they found out was the person that was working on it, despite the fact that all these large companies were using it, had only raised $41.61. He was working for free. Now, Dan and Eric, open source, thoughts? Give us the pros, give us the cons. Dan, Eric, you pick which side you're on.
I think it can be dangerous if you don't have the right resources internally. And to the point that you just made on who's controlling it, what code is actually in there. You know, if I go back to remembering some of the certifications around and some of the classes around pen testing, you know, there's a lot of exploits on there that if you exploit DB, if you can pull them from all kinds of different places. But if you don't have the wherewithal to actually go through the code, understand what it's doing, you don't know what you're running. And again, back to, you could do more damage than good, or, you know, finding the vulnerability that you're looking to find within an organization. So I think there's a level of risk. Now, you can offset that risk with certain skill sets and doing that. But again, that comes back to kind of a risk decision, understanding internal capabilities, risk tolerances, and criticality of systems. So I look at it from my perspective as, you know, I think there's some point tools out there that are open source that are very, very good. But I think as we look at critical systems and systems where we have to meet certain SLAs, be able to respond in a certain time, that it's probably not a great fit. And there's a certain level of hesitation based on the risk involved, or at least my perceived risk involved.
And Dan, before you jump in, Eric, do you know what the largest open source software project is in the world?
Android.
Linux.
Yeah, Android, I guess, wouldn't be open source. Linux, yeah, that's a good point.
And Dan, I'll hand it over to you because I have something to say about that at the very end.
Well, I think that, you know, on the pro side of open source software, I think there's often a barrier to entry that happens in technology, a financial barrier to entry to getting started. Now, this is in the same breath. You know, innovation comes quickly. Innovation requires the ability, in modern day, it requires the ability to spin up, try, and decide if it's going to be successful. And this has built the world that we live in today. This innovation, the companies we all work for, are, you know, built on innovation and the ability to do it quickly and easily. We've seen regulations that have, that have made it harder for companies to get started, for ideas to come to reality. But the open source software, the fact that there's something that's easy, cheap, something that can be tested on and gotten out and vetting an idea is key to making that happen. Without having to find a huge cash outlay. God help you if you want to, spin up an Active Directory to start, but you have Open LDAP that you can go start to do, put your identities together in. Yes, there are free models, but you also don't know the kind of revenues that something's going to generate. So you don't want to put yourself into the point of using a piece of heavy paid technology from the get-go, knowing that you're going to be saddled with it for a very long time. Because what's the reality of changing out all your entire tech stack after you vet it? Nothing.
Right.
Very, very small, for the same reasons that we tell people to bring security into their development life cycle from the earliest moments of creation. When's the right time to bring a security mindset into your startup? From day one. Same thing here. But the existence of it, the maintenance of it, there's a tool for just about everything. And oftentimes, if there isn't, someone will create it. If they have a need, they'll create it and share it back out. And that's good. That's how that's what the internet is. Recall that the internet was about openness and open sharing. Now, granted, it's become commercial, closed, and and surveillance based, but commercial and surveillance based. But the current the ability to have these things is, I think it's game changing for companies to be able to spin up quickly and be able to do interesting things.
I think it also has the opportunity to continue to push certain sectors further because it becomes a challenger, right? But I think it's worth also pointing out that we can't turn this into a binary decision. It's open source.
Exactly.
Or not open source,
I've got 9 things that I just said that now triggered other things on the other side.
Yeah, there's hybrid models. I mean, if we look at, I remember back in the day looking at different SIMs, Alien Vault was one of those ones that came in there. They used a lot of open source in what they did, but they built a support model around it. And it's back to our conversation of just good enough. Now, some would probably argue that it's better than some of the bigger names out on the street. But if you think about it, they were able to take open source components, deliver it with a support model to organizations at a lower cost of entry. So I didn't have to have my own team to run it, but I still had some of that support mechanism that I could fall back on if I needed to. So there is a hybrid.
Oh, without question. And there's the knowing who you are. There's 2 parts. One, knowing who you are about to get into bed with, and with a legal entity, with a company that you are buying, you have some idea of who you are about to begin a relationship with. And the other part is, in open source software, you have paper. So much of risk management these days is in paper. Technology can only take us so far, and we have to rely on contracts, and we have to rely on legal process to take us the rest of the way, because there's no such thing as perfect technology security. We have to put the risk somewhere, somehow, and that goes into paper. In open source worlds, in open source relationships, that's a one-way piece of paper. There's nobody on the other side of it. And so when you have to figure out where that risk is going, you can't send it out. Which means it's just going to stay within your organization, which means you actually have to assess it, understand it, quantify it, and determine whether or not it is acceptable to your organization to keep that particular set of risk inside. And I think many people don't do that. They go, oh, cool, free software, install, next. Well, the Windows model, next, finish. And boom, now I'm running open source software. Although keen listeners will understand that there is no real good open source software that uses a wizard. It's all command line. But there's nobody on the other end of that contract, nobody on the other end of that license, except for potentially the person who left the project 4 years ago, and now there's nobody to support it.
So Dan and Erik, based on your pros and cons, what I'm walking away with here is it depends.
Well, it absolutely depends.
It
does. It depends on what you're going to use it for. It depends on where it's going to go. It depends on what type of information is going to come through it. It depends on how robust the support is. I mean, I'd probably still put my eggs into Apache as a web server. It is robust. It's there. There's good support. There's a good support community. But I also have the same conversation about things like Cold Fusion, where Cold Fusion, a longer in the tooth technology, but when you dig beneath, it's owned by a company. It's owned by Adobe. But when you look behind, it's not immediately visible. But when you look behind, there's an amazing community of people that are supporting it, that know how to run it and run it securely. So it absolutely depends.
And I want to put this out there for all the listeners, including those in security, in information technology. The people that have been working to create these patches and fixes for Log4j have been doing so running 22-hour days, not getting paid.
Yeah.
And they've continued to do this. And this goes back to, you know, Log4j, yes, open source, but there is a community of people that do still work on it and will work on it and are doing so for free. Now, reverting back to, you know, for free, the creator behind Log4j went on to also create several softwares that he was able to sell that incorporated Log4j that he made a good profit from. So he also is helping, backing, and pushing to make sure some of this is getting done on time. And Erik, when I brought up Linux, I thought that was very important to bring up because there is a ton of Linux operating systems on there. And typically people say that's where the crown jewels are kept. So Linux is an open source software, and the code to use to create Linux is free and available to the public to view, to edit, and for users with the appropriate skills to contribute to. And there's actually the Linux Foundation, right? There is a large support base there, and companies across the world. And actually, let me back up. Linux is an open source kernel, right? And then it comes bundled with free and open source software. But they also have proprietary software that they go ahead and sell with Linux that is not free. So it like you said, it depends on the organization, what you're going to be using it for, and what your cost of entry is. And Linux is one of those things that people are building all their applications. I mean, Linux is what the cloud was built on. Like when people look up, that's not just rain droplets formed together. You're not supposed to be looking. You're looking over here at a Linux operating system. I thought that was a good funny.
We're now in the Matrix.
But I thought it was
Part 4.
important to note that about Linux, because I read that first, quote where the person said, this is a systematic risk to the United States and nobody should be using this open source software because it's underfunded, et cetera. Well, there are very good examples, because even that technology firm, I guarantee, uses Linux in its environment.
Right.
But the Linuxes are, while built on open source, are generally have support. It's why you've seen companies like Red Hat, now IBM. It's why you've seen companies like wrap in that same AlienVol model. They're wrapping support and additional tooling around open source. So the expectation is, there is no way that we're going to get away 100% from open source. We don't want to. There are places where it makes sense and places where you can mitigate the risk of something going away by having a support model from something that won't. Will IBM be able? I mean, I've seen Red Hat create patches in the past for other versions of Linux and make them available because they have the skills to do so, even though it wasn't for them. So I think there's more to it than that binary of yes or no.
So, and this is going to be kind of a funny, Dan, Erik. So if someone was to come out with their third version of coffee and named it the Log4j, guaranteed to keep you up all week, and then made sure to remove the label so you didn't know if it was ground or whole bean, would that be appropriate?
I think it would. I would buy that.
That's one step less cruel than me removing all the labels from the cans in my poor mother's pantry when I was young, and you didn't know if you were opening wax beans, the wax beans that have been there for 15 years, because who eats wax beans, or some newer corn. I'd hate to get home and have something pre-ground though, Brian. That's like worse than having wax beans. You want to grind it as you drink it.
No, totally understood. And I brought it up because I thought it was funny. I had mentioned it around a group of friends, and I think I had sent it to you guys, almost like as a meme. And there's been so many of the memes that have come out just over Log4J, but I think I'm not one to summarize, a great debate, but from a lot of the pros and cons that we did today, the takeaway again was it depends. But open source software is here to stay. And for one, the cost of entry in some of the smaller companies that are trying to start up that are going to be there. And then for the others that have developed it as a backbone of some of the technologies and services they offer. And it all comes back to risk, right? And risk mitigation. And just like when a company's putting in a brand new assembly line that they've with brand new, welding technology that they've never used before, there's a risk associated with it. You're hoping that this is going to improve your output or your throughput, right? But then there's other costs that you're going to find out that come with it that you didn't know about. And those are unexpected. And the team rallies together, your quality engineers, your production control engineers, right? And then the next time you apply those learned lessons, right? Yokoten, Genshin Genbutsu, apply those things and learn. Constant improvement, right? Erik, I heard that on the other night all the time. Well, continuous improvement. But essentially that's what we're trying to do. And it's making sure the leadership understands what that risk is in advance. Maybe they're willing to accept it. Maybe they don't even understand it. But then when we come to these problems, I think good teams get together and do the 5 why, right? Or at least some bit of root cause analysis to show, do we know? No, we don't. Why don't we know? Well, because we've never invested in anything around people to be able to maintain it, or 2, around any type of product or storage or anything else that gave us the capability to understand our inventory, right? Or maybe it's as simple as we've just been growing way too fast. And when we started as a small little company, we reached out and used this, right? But we never had a team put in place to think it was important to do so. And by the time we did, it was kind of too late. But that's not a great answer, but it's the truth. And when you understand the truth, then you can go back and say, how can we fix it now? Rather than look somebody in the eyes and say, if someone's scared to tell the truth and say the real reason why, right? Then you're going to continuously have the problem. If you can accept the truth, thank the person for doing it, and then find a way to fix it, you're going to be able to solve problems a lot faster in the future.
And on that note, we've run out of time for this episode of the Great Security Debate. Brian, Erik, thank you again as always. And thanks to you, the listener, for being here with us yet again. We're excited to continue to have our show both in audio format on our website and on our YouTube site. You can search on the Great Security Debate. Please consider subscribing when you're there and telling your friends about us in both mediums. You can find us on our website, www.greatsecurity.debate.net, or you can email us. We'd love your feedback. We want to know more about show ideas. We want to know more about what you like and don't like, so that we can make sure to meet your needs. You can email us feedback@greatsecurity.debate.net, and we're on Twitter @SecurityDebate. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you again on the next Great Security Debate.